It's time for us to do something.
Good evening and welcome to Pellowe Talk. A slightly strange evening for today. It is live streaming and we do have all of your comments available to be put up on the board as we on the screen as we go through this evening. However, we're actually pre-recording the conversation, and that's because it's one of my kids' birthdays tonight, and it's possible for me to be with them, and so that's the right thing to do. So thank you to the guests for coming on early today, and please do remember your live comments are being put on the screen by our great producer who's volunteering tonight, and we would love for you to be part of that conversation. So please do share this live stream to your Facebook group, to your Twitter, or whatever social media you prefer, and then jump into the conversation. You can join the conversation through the live stream where you're watching it on either Facebook or YouTube. And a big welcome to the panel this afternoon. And joining me, we have Professor David Flint, Graham Young, and Joel Jammal. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure, Dave.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, one of the things that I want to spend most of the show talking about tonight is the immense level of frustration that Daniel Andrews is leaving in his wake as he's unveiled this roadmap out, which seems more to be of a toddler scribbling than a roadmap to anywhere, with not a lot of coherence or hope for the average Victorian. There's no punches pulled there. It's very, very accurate because there's a whole lot of frustration there. And this frustration is with, I mean, hopefully the viewers to this program are not new to the conversation we've been having, and many in conservative media have been having, finally, about the gross tyranny of the deprivation of liberty that's going on around Australia, but nowhere worse than in Victoria, where they're still locked in their houses, not allowed to go in more than 5 kilometres from their home, and just extraordinary havoc being wreaked, not only on the economy, but on every life that's affected by the economy, which is pretty much every single Victorian. And so the bulk of today's conversation is going to be about what can we do? What can Victorians do to respond to this? And I guess we're talking about lawful ones as well as civil disobedience. It's an option that has to be critically weighed for its effectiveness and viability and consequences. But then what options aren't on the table, which we should seek to get on the table. So this is going to be a great conversation, and the major objective I want to cover tonight is the concept of recall elections. But that's a sneak peek. We'll get there in just a little while. Graham, why don't you start by summarising the damage and the frustration that's going on in Victoria at the moment. Your organisation has put together a letter with a lot of eminent experts expressing their concerns about the cost, the health cost, the human cost, the mortal cost of prolonged lockdowns. Graham Young.
Yeah, look, I haven't paid specific attention to Victoria. I've looked more at the wider situation in Australia, and the cost that's being imposed on the community to save people from dying of COVID is many times larger than the value of the lives being saved. And I don't want to sound callous in that, but it's not a question of saving lives on one hand and losing them on the other. Whichever way you go, people are going to die, people are going to suffer. Just one illustration of that, Dave, which has come up since we did our letter, and it's the Parliamentary Budget Office has estimated that by 2030, our Australian government debt will be $800 billion larger than it would otherwise be. So you can take that $800 billion as a measure of the cost just for government. It's not the cost to private businesses, to private individuals. It's not the cost to states. it's the cost to the federal budget.
Wow.
When I work that out per life saved, it works out to be about 13 million. Now, you can do a lot with 13 million in terms of medicine, in terms of healthcare, in terms of raising living standards. If the government was to spend all of that 800 billion on hospitals, you could get 444 Gold Coast hospitals. It costs 1.8 billion for the Gold Coast hospital. Labor voters are always going on about we need more health, we need more doctors, we need more teachers. Well, just imagine, 800 million is, I think, off the top of my head, about twice the federal budget. So it is just a huge amount of money. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that there are a lot of people who are going to suffer financially as a result of this. And one of the things that happens when you're poorer is that you live longer, you live shorter rather. And that's for a number of reasons. Partly it's because you can't afford good nutrition or as good a nutrition as other people. But it's also that you can't afford to see doctors and have the sort of medical care that other richer people can have. Now, there's limits to how much extra mortality it creates, but it does create extra mortality. We know that there are people suiciding. I was fascinated to see the other day that the Victorian coroner claimed that there hadn't been an increase in suicides there. But on the other hand, you've got people like Patrick McGorry saying that the calls to suicide helplines are up 20, 30%. We know from the past that there is a relationship between economic depression and suicide. So it's unimaginable to me that there aren't people who are dying because they've lost hope, because they put their life savings into a business, for example, and now they can't pay the bills. In fact, we had a cricket coach up here committed suicide 2 or 3 days ago. His wife was a manager with Flight Centre. Well, there's not a lot of future in that at the moment. And his livelihood had also been influenced by the pandemic. She's got triplets on the way.
That poor family.
Suicide right at the stage when the family needed him the most. That's going to have a bad effect, not just him obviously. That was terminal for him, unfortunately. But for that wife, she's now under tremendous stress. And those kids will be under tremendous stress. That's just one example. So there's a huge amount of cost here. It's not an easy thing, though, to say, well, this is where it evens out and that's the right point to be at. But I think it's pretty easy to say that Daniel Andrews is applying the most draconian conditions in the world. Even, someone pointed out, more draconian than in Wuhan in the first place. So the cost there has got to be higher and more unnecessary than anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be hard to overstate the impact of what's going on, and there's so many aspects and facets that are well beyond mere financial. It would be silly for anybody to think that the critics of lockdown are only concerned about financial impacts. Professor Flint, one of the suggestions that I've seen is that perhaps Scott Morrison should intervene in the tyranny going on in Victoria. As a constitutional law professor, what rights does the Prime Minister have to intervene when a state premier is so abusing our God-given freedoms?
Well, the Prime Minister has more powers than he should have. The federal government has more powers than it should have. It has put itself in the position, with the help of the High Court, over about 100 years, of doing something which doesn't exist in any other comparable federation. That is, it completely dominates the fiscal situation in Australia. I think the Commonwealth now collects about 80% of the taxes in Australia and hands back about 40% on various conditions. And it would be open to the Prime Minister. I don't think it's right, but it would be open for the Prime Minister to use that fiscal power. He may need legislation to help him in some respects, but he could impose very strong fiscal constraints on Victoria to require them to do what he wants them to do. In fact, the Prime Minister could take much more of a powerful position than he has, for example, in relation to the border closures, which are causing serious problems across Australia, none of which can be justified on medical grounds. You can't justify the closing off a whole state for the purpose of this virus. It's being done in Queensland and Western Australia, obviously for electoral reasons. It may have some passing popularity among people who don't think deeply about these things, but it's certainly not what should be happening in Australia. And it would be open to the Prime Minister to seek urgent action on this by the High Court, but he pulled out of the case that Clive Palmer brought in relation to Western Australia, obviously because of some arrangement with the West Australian government. And he shows no interest in relation to the Queensland border. So I don't expect him to be using such circular powers that he has. In addition, he has, again, because of the High Court, considerable powers in relation to treaties. And he could claim that international health treaties give him the power to legislate with respect to Victoria. He would have to call the Parliament together and legislate to control Victoria. He shows absolutely no inclination to do that. In fact, the Prime Minister, as with every other Premier, I think is part of the problem. The whole National Cabinet consists of people who've completely, I think, misunderstand their role, misjudge the situation. When the situation arose by March, in my view, they should have not done what they are now programmed to do. The problem with all of the members of the National Cabinet and most politicians is that they have now decided that they are programmed to react not to evidence. They all wish to react to computer programming. And as the George Box, who was probably the greatest statistician of the 20th century, Anglo-American, said, all modelling is wrong, but it's all useful. It's rather like all opinion polls. Most opinion polls are wrong, but they're useful. The same with most modelling. It can be useful. But they idiotically chose, as did a number of other countries, to follow Imperial College and Washington State University, both of which, particularly Imperial College, had a record of producing over the years exaggerating modelling, not just modelling which is as bad as that in relation to global warming, but much more seriously wrong modelling in relation to diseases. And we heard in Australia...
I've actually seen commenters, qualified commentary on that from similarly qualified people as that which produced that modelling, describing it as not fit for purpose.
Well, I think that would be so. And it's a tool, but to treat it as the truth. I mean, you have politicians, for example, Mr. Biden in America and Senator Wong, they talk about the science, as though there's one juggernaut of science, which tells you immediately what to do. And of course, it's not at all like that.
Correct.
Scientists disagree too. But I think they're all in the wrong. They should never have agreed on a lockdown. They should have looked at world's best practice. But the Victorian Premier is the absolutely worst of the lot because he's dragging it out because of his own serious errors. And he misbehaved appallingly over the quarantine, as we know. And now he's landing the result of that on the Victorian people. And there's an terrible overreaction in relation to this virus.
Yeah.
So, but you asked what the Prime Minister can do. He could do more, but he won't, I don't think.
Yep. Joel, we've heard it described, I think without hyperbole, that the lockdown in Victoria is the worst in the world. It's even worse than being in Wuhan, where they were welding the doors shut and barricading people into their apartment blocks. Now, Dan hasn't done that yet, but if the Prime Minister could step in, another very important question, relating to the purpose of federation as we understand it, although that understanding is now quite diminished in its commonality. Should the Prime Minister step in?
Look, my fellow panelists paint a very stark image of what's been happening in Victoria. I mean, the economic impacts are incredible. And the good professor points out that the level of overreach that we've seen from the government on a number of different areas completely bastardized the Constitution. I mean, we are far beyond what our forefathers intended when they wrote our Constitution and Commonwealth. I mean, for me to, and this is the problem. I'm not a fascist. I describe myself as a Christian conservative. I believe in moral capitalism. But the little fascist voice in me says Scott Morrison should do this. He should be the strong man, and he should completely overhaul the Victorian government. They had no right to do X, Y, and Z, including the Belt and Road Initiative. It's unconstitutional. But the conservative in me says that is very short-sighted, and that only achieves my long-term goals. And I don't want other parties to have that power in the future. In fact, that's how things got so bad. So I've got to be honest with you, Dave. You know, young people, they're usually in a position where they're optimistic. I'm not optimistic. I don't see how we chart our way out of this. But the most powerful thing that I can see happening through this, because I don't think Scott Morrison has the stomach to do anything. I really don't. I call him Silent Scott, because he was elected by Quiet Australia to not be silent, but he's been everything but that recently. Now, look, there was something encouraging I've been seeing the last couple of days, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this from the panel. We've seen over 10, 15,000 people out on the streets around Australia. I think we saw 5,000 in Adelaide, 5,000 in Queensland, around the place. I think about 1,000 maybe in Victoria, and 1,000 in Sydney. Now, I saw a very big shift from the government and the conservative media once they saw people out there and speaking out. I noticed Scott Morrison pivot, and I get the feeling that Dan Andrews' days are numbered. However, it highlights
that is optimistic. I don't know what you're saying. You weren't optimistic before.
I'm not optimistic about the bastardization of the Constitution, how far it's gone. Dan Andrews is just a placeholder for now. There will always be another Dan Andrews. I don't see the system changing, and the system is the problem right now. I don't want any more constitutional overreach, but I have a feeling that that's what we're going to need to get out of this mess. But one thing the progressives have right is the constitutions we have in a lot of our Anglosphere countries, they're incompatible right now. They got us very far for a long time, but they have not been able to deal with the technological advancements and the government overreach. And I think it's time for an update, which is widely sort of consulted by the community. We need to bring the best ideas to the forefront, not from people who have been in politics their whole lives, from average people out there. Now, this leaves the door open to socialism and communism, but just as the founding of America and their founding document, it was average people, well-educated people that came out, and they all had their say. Not what's happening now. There is a revolution going on around the world from the left and the right. They're not happy with their constitution. No one is happy with it. And I think it shows the colliding of these worlds due to technology. There's greater information out there, just like with the Gutenberg printing press. And as a result, the curtain has been ripped. We are seeing how disgusting the swamp is in every political city around the world, whether it's 10 Downing Street in the UK, whether it's Washington in the US, and whether it's Canberra in Australia. And we're going to need very educated people like the professor himself pointing this out. And on top of that, we're going to need people like Graham, my fellow panelist, who is pointing out the dangers of terrible paths. Now, if you don't mind me saying, Dave, there have been some very terrible, this is going to go down in history as one of the worst managed health crises ever in this 21st century. The level of information and capability we have to botch it, how we have, is insane. I mean, Graham touched on suicides. I'm a part of 1 million Australians who lost their job. I mean, I'm young, I'm educated, I've got a degree under my arm. There's no reason why I shouldn't have a job right now, except by my own choices. But that's not the case. The government completely botched this thing. In fact, I would argue that it's undeniable that the lockdown is worse than the virus itself. I mean, a study out of the UK, and this is the last thing I'll end on, a study in the UK found that due to people missing their medical checkups and not detecting cancer early, 35,000 people will die because of the lockdown they had earlier this year. And that's assuming there's no more lockdowns. How much is it in Australia? It's about half that, if we're going to be rough. But look, that's what I'll add, Dave.
Thank you, Joel. Graham, next question will be for you to lead us a little bit further on. We've had Professor David Flint tell us a little bit about Scott Morrison's options, and Joel Jammal tell us a little bit about the oughts of federation and the Commonwealth Constitution. But what about the Victorian Constitution? What's the options for the Governor of Victoria? If you could speak to both the possibilities and the merits of any options that he may or may in fact not have right now.
Well, I wouldn't have thought he had many options at all. The government's not acting illegally. It has done some things which I think are undemocratic, but it's done it arguably through a democratic process of getting legislation through both houses of parliament. So I would think that the governor, and in fact I would hope, that he's sitting there with hands tied. Just listening to the previous discussion, I agree with David that the Prime Minister's got more options than he ought to have. And on the basis of that, I don't think he ought to use a lot of them. I think one of the problems with our federation is that when something goes wrong in a state, we look to the federal government to bail the state out. So what that leads to is...
We've just lost you for the moment. You've frozen on what that leads us to.
Can I come in on that, Dave?
Yeah, Graham, we'll come back to you.
Sorry
and
about that.
see if
Is
you rectified now? Okay.
Hello?
Yep.
Can you hear us?
We'll
Can you hear
actually
me?
yes, but let's just give it a minute or two to recover a little bit better and stabilize. And in the meantime, we'll let David jump in with what he has.
Sorry, I'm back.
Professor Flint, what did you have to add to that?
All I wanted to add is that the Victorians, like the people of every other state who had it, got rid. Well, they didn't get rid of it. It was the political parties, by a consensus, got rid of the power of the upper house. Now, the present upper house wouldn't exercise the power. We saw how foolishly they acted in relation to the extension of the state of emergency. But there was a power there in the upper house which was used on a number of occasions in Victoria. Victoria had more occasions of this than any other part of the Commonwealth, and that was the power of the upper house, to use the power to withhold supply, to force a government to an election. It took place on a number of occasions in Victoria, but it was done away with in 2005. The chances of a governor acting in relation to possibly illegal activity, there's some aspects which, if not illegal, are at least unlawful, I suspect. But the likelihood of a governor doing this, I think, is pretty minimal, particularly the present governor. I don't think she would be inclined to that. The last time was, of course, in New South Wales, when the Lang government was dismissed by Philip Gain because he was acting illegally. In fact, he should have been paying money to the bondholders, and he wasn't. In fact, he to avoid a federal garnishee, because the money had been handed over to the Commonwealth to pay to the bondholders, some of whom were overseas. He went to the State Bank in Sydney in his chauffeur-driven car, withdrew all the money from the accounts and took the money round to the Trades Hall, where the money was kept for the rest of the period. The governor warned him a few times and eventually dismissed him. Whitlam,
The good old days.
Yes, Whitlam behaved unlawfully in that Whitlam knew that once supply was withheld and he couldn't deliver the supply, he should have resigned, and eventually the Governor General moved in and withdrew his commission. So there's an example of unlawful activity. The Premier of Victoria is probably, or the ministers are probably acting unlawfully in terms of the recent decision concerning the export cattle ban in Queensland under a few governments, the last Labor government, the Gillard government. Only recently that reached the courts. That shows how long these things take. But the judge found that the subordinate legislation which was being exercised by the minister was beyond what he should have been doing, that he should have been exercising the power to control exports, just to control that part of exports which were questionable and going to dangerous, risky abattoirs in Indonesia. But he had a flat ban, and the judge in the federal court found that that was going too far because you have a common right to conduct business. Now, I suspect that a lot of these decisions taken in the National Cabinet are then given effect by a minister in a state government. They don't even have the decency these days, that these silly politicians, instead of handing it over to the Executive Council where at least there's some verification by the governor, they've given the power to make delegated legislation in the hands of a minister. A lot of these ministers have absolutely no background. They've never had a real job. And they take decisions which are far beyond what is necessary.
Yep. Let's come back to Graham.
I think a lot of these are probably unlawful on examination.
Graham, you were saying what these are going to lead to.
Well, what I was working up to was to say that democracy's actually been pretty resilient, and that it might actually be in the best interest of everyone, painful though it will be, to let things play out in the normal course of events in Victoria. The last time you got a good government in Victoria, it was because of the meltdown under Kane and then Kerner, although she was really an accessory rather than the principal. And that gave you Jeff Kennett, because people actually understand when things are going badly and they will take steps that they wouldn't otherwise take. So that's one issue. Another issue is if the federal government were to step in, or if the governor were to step in, there would be a very strong body of opinion that said they were acting unlawfully. I'm not saying correct opinion, but just a very strong body.
Sure.
And that would set up a really strong partisan argument. And we've obliquely referred to, or no, directly, David referred to the 1975 dismissal of Whitlam. I think if Malcolm Fraser had had his time over again, he might not have blocked supply. They might not have tried to, they forced a double dissolution halfway through the 3-year term of Whitlam, because if they hadn't done all of that, the government would have turned over naturally. Fraser still would have got a huge majority, but he wouldn't have had this thing hanging over his head, the idea that what he'd done was illegitimate and that his wasn't a legitimate government. I think that actually crimped his wings. So, when you look at Victoria, it's not just Victorians who are suffering. It's the second largest economy in the country. So everyone is suffering as a result of it, but Victorians more than others. I think if you want to get good government down there, you probably have to wait 2.5 years now to the something like that, the next election, and let the electors take their revenge out against Daniel Andrews.
Graham, what do you think about the possibility of Victorians voting with their feet in the meantime and doing that wonderful option available in a competitive federation of leaving the state that doesn't come close to making them happy, taking their business, taking their real estate investment and transporting it? Easier than it sounds, but is it harder than continuing to live under dictator Dan with no guarantee that the good people of Victoria will be good enough at the next election?
Well, I'm sure there will be a lot of that happening. There are a lot of people whose livelihoods don't depend on being in one place. People who are retired, people who are on welfare, and places like Queensland have balmier temperatures. You live a little bit longer up here. You can sell a modest house in Melbourne and buy a magnificent house in Brisbane for the same money and have some change left over. And there's precedent for it. Back in 1970 something, I think it was, or maybe the early 80s. David can correct me on the date if I'm wrong. Joh Bjelke-Petersen abolished death duties up here. And that was largely responsible for the growth of the Gold Coast and, to a lesser extent, the Sunshine Coast. And a lot of Victorians who were closer to going on to the next world than most of us moved up here so they could pass most of what they'd amassed in this world to their heirs and descendants.
Yep.
I'm sure that will happen when the borders are opened up, which I think, if anything's illegal and what's happening at the moment, I think what we're doing with the borders is, and I'm not a big fan of Clive Palmer's, but I've got my fingers crossed for his action against the West Australian government. And along with David, I'm disgusted that the federal government actually pulled out of that action.
Joel, I know of quite a few people. I know of real estate agents in Brisbane who do not have enough stock for demand from Victoria right now. They're selling houses as fast as they can list them to Victorians. Do you think it's only I think to even get out of the state, all you have to do is just even get a rental agreement. So the property markets outside Victoria may be being supported by Victorians largely at the moment. Do you think relocating is the option to relocate is one of the strengths of competitive federalism?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the chief example of this is looking at the US right now. There's 50 states there. It's a very big market and very competitive, and that forces states to do, incredible sort of work, or we can see which states are doing terrible jobs. I mean, New York State, you literally had Governor Chris Cuomo. Was it Andrew Cuomo? Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think Andrew's the governor.
Was it Andrew Cuomo, not Chris on CNN?
Chris is the CNN brother, yeah.
Yeah, and Andrew, he was literally begging people, don't leave the state. We need the rich people to stay for taxes. And so now they're going to have billions of dollars worth of a budget shortfall. So they have to cut a bunch of different services, which they really don't want to cut in social services. Where are people moving? Well, all over the place. I mean, California is a classic. There's a danger that it's going to flip Texas blue with the amount of people moving to Texas because of the low taxes in Texas. I mean, we even saw the most popular podcast in the world, Joe Rogan, that gets billions of downloads every year. He moved his studio to Texas because things are so terrible in California. I mean, they repealed the American Civil Rights Act.
I actually retweeted
in California.
I retweeted a tweet from the California governor this morning where he was asking everybody to turn off their air conditioners in the middle of a heat wave at 3:30 in the afternoon. It's just like, well, guys, we've gone too green. Can you stop using electricity, please?
It's just a disaster. My mum was over there and she was talking about how great California was. And I was like, which part were you in? Because there's literally apps. You can download apps on your phone, which will tell you where the poop hotspots are, because the housing
That's
crisis
disgusting.
over there, the homeless crisis is insane. There are syringes everywhere. There are laws which don't allow police to move people on. There are businesses that are leaving. On top of that, California repealed the American Civil Rights Act. So that means you can discriminate based on skin color and gender and all of that. That's insane. That's insane.
It's very libertarian of them.
Yeah, it is very free market. And so
California, the only state in the union where the dogs clean up their owner's poo on the sidewalk.
Exactly. And look, now we're seeing states that didn't lock down in the US. There are some Republican-run states, they never locked down, and they've seen net increases in their net output. But look,
Yeah.
I did want to touch on the constitutional crisis of this, of someone from the monarchy sort of stepping in. I mean, you did cite the reference in Australian politics where we did have a government dismissed, and the push for a republic at that time was at a record high. I don't think correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we've seen anything like that since then. Now, people did not like that at all. We saw a very similar case in the UK recently. Last year, they had a situation where the parliament was at a gridlock in negotiating Brexit. This is mid last year. And there were calls for people to get the Queen encouraging the Queen as much as they could through the media to possibly dissolve Parliament and completely start fresh, because they were just at a deadlock. But you know what? She stayed out of it. She did what she always does, which is the lovely thing, and just sort of lets them work things out, because she's seen a few years, hasn't she? And what did we see? We saw a landslide, a once in 100-year sort of landslide. There are Labor seats for 100 years. They'd never gone Conservative, and they got massively defeated. In fact, it was an 80-seat majority for the Conservatives, which is huge. That's massive. And so, look, I guess I agree with Graham on this. I think you got to let the market play it out. Victoria, as individuals, they can move out if they want to change it, if they want to go down with the ship, if they want to do whatever they want. It's a free country, they can do whatever they want. And I think, Western Australia, if we're going to be fair, Western Australia is in a similar case.
Professor Flint, in a competitive federation where states start to, sediment with layers of political philosophies attracted to different states. We see it markedly in America, so much so that it even goes down to the level of cities being particularly Democratic or Republican. If Victoria continues to become more and more left-wing, leftist, radical, green, socialist, is it a good thing if Conservatives leave the state for Queensland or South Australia, New South Wales, and some of the other more leftist people who are looking for a more leftist government end up in Victoria, and thus creating bigger differences? Will that lead to a bigger percentage of people who are happy with their government of whatever type it may be? And how mobile is a population generally to be able to take advantage of those kind of differentiations?
It's not that long ago that California was a Republican state, Ronald Reagan state. These things change, people change their views. I don't think these things are necessarily locked into one position or the other. Queensland was thought of once as a very conservative state. You didn't often get, if you got Labor governments, they tended to be conservative. I don't think people stay as they are. There's a complaint, I gather, in Texas that the sort of people who are coming in to get the advantages of living in such a liberal, a small L liberal state with low taxes, they're coming in and they're changing the voting. They're tending to vote Democrat and changing what Texas. I don't think you can lock these things in. But what I do think we should be looking at, and we've had this terrible long period right back to 1920 of over-centralizing Australia. What we should be looking at, I think, is increasing the amount of direct democracy in the country. One of our problems is that our political parties are highly centralized. They've got more centralized, and they've taken away a lot of the powers of the members of the parties. They're quite often, particularly in New South Wales, run by cabals who don't have much to do with the membership of the party. That applies on both sides. And I think that there is a good argument for increasing the amount of direct democracy in Australia, as you find in, for example, the classic cases in Switzerland. We, at the time of Federation, we decided to take from the Swiss the referendum, but the whole initiation of the process always lies with Canberra. So every referendum in Australia has to be to increase Commonwealth powers, not to decrease them. I think if we had more direct democracy, we could rely more on the good sense of the ordinary Australians. And I think that a lot of Australians have more common sense than a lot of the politicians, particularly those in small business, those in farms. They're quite often more sensible. They come to more sensible decisions. The political parties seem to be obsessed with curious dogma at the moment, global warming and gender fluidization or whatever it's called, all sorts of fashionable ideas which seem to come in from the United States. And I think if we, for example, did look seriously at recall elections, not that they'd be used often, but they would be something hanging over the head of a man like Andrews or a government like his. A number of American states do have recall elections. We were going to...
Let me interrupt you there and ask you to explain what a recall election is. Assume I know absolutely nothing, have never heard of the term before, don't know what it looks like, where else it works in the world, and what might work in Australia. What is a recall election?
In the simplest example, it would be an electoral provision or constitutional provision which provides that if a certain percentage, and it could be as low as 12%, as it is in California, if a 12% of the electorate signed a petition calling for an election within a particular electorate or the whole government, because it can apply to a governor in the United States. If such a petition was signed, a new election would be called. And this became an issue in New South Wales when Barry O'Farrell was the leader of the opposition and the then Labor government was increasingly unpopular. And Barry O'Farrell decided to take it on board, and he promised that if the Liberals were elected to government, he would set up a committee, an expert committee, to examine that. Well, they didn't appoint the committee as carefully as they might, because the committee, to their surprise, came down with a majority decision in favour of introducing recall elections in New South Wales. And I remember a friend of mine asked the Attorney General at the time, he said, well, you said you'd look at it, you got a favourable decision, why aren't you introducing it? He said, well, the facts are different now. The Liberal Party's in government, so why would we introduce recall elections? So we didn't get it in New South Wales, and it was promised. Now, that's a wonderful thing for a government to have in its mind, to know that if it misbehaves, as clearly the Victorian government is, a sufficient number of people might sign a petition, 12%, 20%, 40%, whatever it is. And it's not something which happens all the time, even in those states that have them. It's hard. You've got to get people to come out and openly sign a petition and have their addresses verified and so on. But it does happen, and it can happen. It can lead to a change of government. Last time in one American state, it led to an increased majority for the governor. But it's a very democratic thing to do.
So I'm interested in the mechanics of that. Would the Electoral Commission of the state or Commonwealth administrate that? Or is it just a slip of paper that any private citizen can pass around until there's, you know, 1 million signatures on it? Or could it be done securely digitally? I guess it would be up to the framers of the legislation, but what are your thoughts in particular?
Well, I think in our case, it would have to be kept at the Electoral Commission. We don't have, I think that the Americans have an advantage. They didn't centralize the running of the electoral system to the degree we have. And you do see odd things happening in America. In some states, you do see a degree of fraud. But what we did was we made the mistake, I think, of centralizing it, federal at least. And that means if the system goes bad, as it did under Hawke, where the system was weakened and we've introduced the potential for significant amounts of fraud in the Australian system, it would be done by the Australian electoral system. I'm not saying the electoral system is corrupt, but the system is such, and it's not so much multiple voting, that is a problem, obviously. there should be some control. If you're letting people, before Hawke, you could vote anywhere. You had to vote in the subdivision that you were directed to vote in. You could apply for an absentee vote, but that's where you had to basically cast your vote. Now, I can vote in about 40 different places. So if I weren't known, I could vote 40 times. And the role is, it is obvious that there are interests that want to keep our system corrupt, because the roll should be linked electronically, so that when your name is crossed off where you vote, it should be crossed off right throughout the Commonwealth and in any overseas place, so you can't vote again. At least there'll be a question if you try to vote again, if there isn't proper identification. But the big leakage in our system is it's so easy to enrol. And Howard tried to stop that. Howard tried to stop it by legislating that the roll would close on the day the election was called. So when that had been in place for a few terms, Get Up organised a couple of people to petition the High Court. One hadn't bothered to register. Everybody knew an election was coming. One didn't bother to register. The other didn't bother to correct his change of address. They went to the High Court. The High Court did somersaults, which they're not doing at the moment in relation to the Section 92 case. They're doing everything to delay it. But in that case, they rushed through the decision so it could be heard before the 2010 election. And they handed down their decision without giving their reasons. They waited to give their reasons till Christmas, which is about 5 months away. And they dropped it in just before Christmas. Nobody noticed what their reasons were. They gave their decision, and they found that there was something in the Constitution that said you couldn't close the rolls at the time when the election was called. I think you could turn the Constitution inside out, and you can't find any clear provision as to why that should happen. So we have the situation in Australia where the rolls stay open for a week, and during that week, there's a massive amount of fraudulent registrations, particularly in marginal seats. And that happened in 2010. Get Up boasted foolishly. They boasted as to what they did as a result of that. They said, we got 100,000 extra names onto the roll, which they did. And it meant that instead of the Gillard government being defeated, you might recall, it was a hung parliament.
Wow.
And
significant.
yes, so I think it's very important that we give the people of Australia, because I can't see who else we can rely on. You can't rely on the politicians. They're all deranged. They all think they can change the climate on the basis of computer modelling. And they take every new idea coming from America and spend days on it and have, for example, the plebiscite they had on same-sex marriage, and so it gets out of hand. So I think there's still in Australia a solid, sound group of people with common sense who will do things, who will control the politicians. You need two significant controls, I think. Firstly, recall elections as a sort of guillotine hanging over the heads of the politicians. But secondly, you need the right for people to initiate referendums on all manner of things, treaties, for example, on legislation, on introducing new legislation. We should give carte blanche to the people, as they have in Switzerland, and they do it very well. And I think this would vastly improve and control the politicians. The politicians are completely unaccountable. And they go to elections, most of which are confected, because the pre-selections are pre-arranged, at least in this state they are. It's not the ordinary members of the Liberal Party. In vast parts of New South Wales, they won't let you into the party because the person who's got the seat there stops people getting into that party.
Yes,
So
that certainly that certainly does go on. I want to encourage everybody. You are going to get the opportunity to hear a lot more of Professor David Flint and his deep knowledge of Australian and world political history. as well as the strategies and tools that we may have at our disposal in a show that he's now producing on the Good Source website every Thursday called Take Back Your Country. So I want to encourage you to look for that on Thursdays at goodsource.news. Also, if you would like to be involved in supporting the production of The Good Source, there's a supporters page on that channel there. And very soon, we're going to be launching a members section, which will have bonus content that won't be broadcast and will be the extended interviews, etc., that are going on. So to help fight fake news, head to goodsource.news and become a supporter there for a low or generous monthly amount. And certainly in these hard economic times, everything is generous, and that's very much appreciated. Graham Young, I'm actually struck by and quite enamored by the idea of recall elections, especially in your and my home state of Queensland, where we have no upper house, no legislative council to hold the government to account. We have 4-year elected dictatorships. And it seems to me that the threat and the possibility of a recall election would be very, very good at moderating the enthusiasm of runaway hubris that we've seen so often from the 25 years of recent Labor government here in this state, but across the nation. Victoria is the current dictatorship that we would like a democratic solution to. What do you think about recall elections? Are they a good idea? And how do you think they would best work in Australian contexts?
Well, until you approached me about this session, I hadn't really thought too hard about recall elections. I can't actually think of too many instances in Australian history where one would have been successful or justified. But I'd like to take up what David was talking about more, which was citizen-initiated referenda, which is something that our think tank supports as an idea, that if you can get a certain threshold number of people supporting a proposition, then it should be able to be put to the people. You make a very good point about an upper house. We don't have a policy on an upper house here. I don't think you're going to get any parliamentary party in Queensland to reinstate one. And when you look at some of the upper houses interstate, perhaps that's a good thing because they don't fulfil the function that they ought to fulfil. But something like a citizen-initiated referenda, which I would think, be easier to get up and to also make changes to government policy, I think that would be a really good thing. You know, I remember Proposition 13, I think it was, in California back in the late 70s, which kicked off the tax revolt around the world, which led to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, to a lesser extent Malcolm Fraser, but then John Howard. You know, the steering but not rowing philosophy of government, not spending any more money than the government needs to, doing things, regarding the government as a trustee of money which isn't actually theirs, it belongs to the people. Those sorts of ideas came out of that referendum. They have a lot of these referendums in the US. They add propositions to ballot papers and people vote on them. So, you know, I think that's likely to be more useful, likely to be more practical, and likely to have greater effect.
Joel, what are your thoughts on recall elections? For it, against it? Any details you'd like to see implemented? How would it look like? And are you aware of any parties out there with a good policy regarding this, which could be considered and supported by potential voters?
Yeah, no, look, absolutely. I'm in complete agreement with Graham and the professor on that. I definitely think recall elections should definitely be instituted. I mean, and also the referenda that the US sort of have every time they go for an election is an excellent idea. They should put 4 or 5 different things to the electorate. Do you agree on this? Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. That's the more democracy, the better. Now, I had the Solicitor General for New South Wales in studio last week, and he often made the point a government overreach is just, you got to reconcile. There's a reckoning that will come for it eventually, and I think we need to get ahead of that. We really need to make sure we do this as soon as possible, because the longer we leave it, the more pent up people's anger will get, and the more people will see jumping on the streets and really expressing their anger. Now, I did also have last week, I dedicated a whole episode of The Arc, which is the other show I host, with Ricardo Bossi, who's the leader of the A1 political party. We dedicated the whole thing pretty much to electoral fraud. Now, Ricardo referenced a swing electorate in Queensland, where there's the odd numbers on one side and the odd numbers on the other side, which was beach. Yet there were registered voters where the beach was, which is insane, absolutely insane. And it's stories like what the professor is talking about that just it's very disillusioning about the electoral system. I'm very concerned about. I mean, if we can't, what's the point in starting a new party if you can't tackle those problems already? I mean, how do we know if there's going to be a free and fair election? In fact, I made the point in my recent article for The Good Source, which was an exclusive, that there's a very good chance that the US election, we may not have a result ever for the US election coming up. In fact, we might even end up with President Nancy Pelosi on January 20th next year because of mail-in voting, universal mail-in voting, not absentee mail-in voting. That's a big problem. And we're going to see, I mean, the 50 days of rioting at the White House is starting in a week or so, where they're calling it the 50-day siege of the White House. That's how bad things can get. So we can definitely screw this up, and we need to be very careful. But you know what? Ricardo Bossi's party, A1, it goes a step further. They also introduce primaries, which is what we see in the US. How better to find the best candidate for your electorate than to have primaries within a party? So it's not a constitutional thing. It's within the party. That's true leadership. Now, I like what a number of different parties are doing.
Would you have to be a member of that party?
Absolutely. To
Right.
vote on the primary, absolutely.
Isn't that what we already have with pre-selections? How's that different?
Well, if you think about it, how do you pick with pre-selections in different parties? They've got different rules, but a lot of it isn't as democratic as you'd hope. In fact, that was the whole. Exactly. See, it speaks for itself. See, I've seen the inner workings.
In the Labor Party, the unions get half the say.
Exactly. But I've done a lot of time in the Christian Democrat Party, and I helped Fred Nile reform his party very well. And we tried to reform a bunch of these different things, and there was a lot of different nepotism that we saw. There was a bunch of different corrupt sort of inner workings that we saw on a board, and we cleared out the whole board, reduced the average age of the board down 30 years, which is amazing. And look, I've seen a lot of these changes that need to take place, and it can be done. Now, we've got a bunch of different parties which look very promising. I mean, One Nation's doing a pretty good job. The Constitution needs one hell of a work. I mean, I don't like the dictator as much as I like Pauline Hanson, I don't like how much she's sort of overlooks the whole situation and has the final say. But what I see in Australia One is really promising, and I wish them all the best in going forward with this. And I hope that because they do that, it raises the bar for all other parties, and they have to follow that as well.
A few bold ideas there, Graham. I do want to start working towards the end of this episode of Pellowe Talk. But what are your thoughts on the idea of primaries for political parties?
Yeah, well, as you're possibly familiar with the LNP up here, and they have a plebiscite system, which is a bit like a primary. I don't actually have a problem with the idea of a primary anyway. So in the US, you don't have to be a member. You don't even have to be a registered Republican or Democrat voter. One of the problems that I think we've got in party politics, and primaries don't solve all of this, but they solve part of this, is that they're run more and more like clubs or even businesses. So you have to conform to the dictates of the people who are running it, and they're hard to get because, they only let people in who are on side.
Which has been used against, I think it's been weaponised against Conservatives across the majors, both parties being dragged leftwards. And look, I've written on this recently article, and you've published it in your journal, Online Opinion. Would Howard's Broad Church invite in Karl Marx? The concept is that let's bring the debate into the tent, and yet what we're actually seeing is conservatives being excluded from the party, which is meant to include libertarians and conservatives, which is the way Howard defined his broad tent.
Well, I think Howard defined it similarly to the way Menzies would have, which was you had conservatives and you had free traders, and it was those two groups being part of the broad church, not just anyone that wanted to be part of the Liberal Party. I mean, Malcolm Fraser had a very bad experience. He set up the Australian Conservation Foundation. Don't know how many people recall that, but it got effectively stacked out against him. It started off as a centre-right, or at least middle-of-the-road organisation, but it very quickly moved to the left. I disagree that the Liberal Party's moved that far to the left. I think we moved in a more libertarian direction through the late 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And what I'm seeing is something which is not dissimilar to the kind of Liberal Party that I joined back in the 70s. So, I joined the party in 1977. What's that, 43 years ago? And there was a lot of people who were just there for social reasons, didn't really understand the philosophy that strongly. And then it was the battle between the wets and the dries, and the bad economic circumstances, partly created by Gough Whitlam, that moved the party in the direction of rational economics, not necessarily less conservative, but certainly more economically rational and less interested in protection. So it's kind of moved away from that, I think, because, political parties and human beings respond to stimuli. And the stimulus hasn't been there. We've had it so good. I think a lot of the problems we've got in society at the moment are the problems of plenty, the problems of wealth. It's that well-known cycle they say about families, from rags to rags in 3 generations. First generation makes it, the second generation builds it, the third generation just takes it for granted and hands it away. I think, in some respects, our political party, certainly the Liberal Party, is in that kind of position. They need a bit of bad luck to reform. And you can't create bad luck. It comes along, and you don't want to create bad luck.
Yeah. I do push back on the notion. We won't spend a lot of time in this. I'll just invite myself to have the last word, if you'll permit my indulgence. Thank you. That the Liberal Party has not gone that far left, I think, is effortlessly refuted by Pine's article, wishing for President Biden over President Trump. And I think that, there's plenty more examples. That's not an isolated example, but the idea that somebody like him, who's very much a left of centre politician, is probably neither somebody who should have been in Howard's government, and certainly wouldn't have been in Menzies.
Google John Gorton or Ian McPhee.
Well, for a Liberal Party Prime Minister to march against extant marriage laws in a political leftist protest, I think's a reflection on the temperature of the Liberal Party.
Don't forget, we're pretty sure Menzies didn't vote Liberal a few times after he ceased being Prime Minister.
And that's a testament to how disappointed he was with the hijacking of some of the concepts that he espoused. And you're right, he didn't. But I do want to bring Professor Flint in to wrap up the conversation, with especially, I guess, re-articulating and reasserting a concise case for the innovation of recall elections in state and Commonwealth constitutions, and then we'll whip around for a wrap up from everybody again. Actually, let's do that now. So, Graham, you get the final word on our little retorts there, and then Joel, and we'll wrap up with David presenting the case for recall elections again.
Well,
feel free to say anything you want on any topic, including my assertions.
No, well, that was only a minor part of what we're talking about. I think
Sure.
the people of Victoria have got to deal with Daniel Andrews, and some of us have got our own problems with our own premiers. But you know, I don't think you can hasten the path of democracy. It takes people sometimes a long time to recognise they've made a mistake.
Well said.
And the hardest, or rather the silliest thing to do, is to try and persuade them they've made a mistake before they've been led to that conclusion themselves. But I think things like recall elections and citizen-initiated referenda are things that ought to be looked at very seriously and adopted. We need more timely citizen involvement in elections, and we live in a time now where things happen much faster than they did. You know, the reason we've got a problem with this virus to a certain extent is we live in a very mobile world. The reason we've got a problem with some of the ideas we've got a problem with is that mobility extends to the internet and how we communicate. I think that means that you probably do need more regular input from the populace to keep the ship of state sailing in the right direction. Otherwise, to borrow from the young lady who resigned from the New York Times, where she said, it's not on the masthead, but Twitter appears to be the editor of this paper. We'll end up finding out that Twitter isn't elected to any parliament in Australia and doesn't sit in any government house, but it ends up ruling the roost.
Yeah, I do echo your sentiments on letting people realise that they've made a mistake. I think in that spirit, I opposed the changes to the ballot preferential voting system. I thought the aberrations of some of the micro parties' ascendancies, such as Ricky Muir from the Motoring Enthusiasts Party and the Clive Palmer experiment, were things that would be self-evident correcting lessons, and indeed they were. But I think that would have been possible without changing all those things unnecessarily. I did like the way it was before. But anyway, Joel, your final thoughts for this evening.
Yeah, look, I think a Liberal Senator for New South Wales, Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells, said it best. Australia would be a lot better if every seat was a marginal seat. That says a lot. I think that people in Australia need to recognise that you can lose this. Free democracy is a blip in history. We can lose it due to big tech, due to government, due to anything. So what you need to do, the solution to that, is we need to be a little bit more like the Americans. Not violent, but more active. We need to treat this not like a religion, but like our life and our families' lives depend on it. Because these issues, if you know, Jordan Peterson has a new rule in his book, in his upcoming book. Not many people have heard it. He told me personally. He said, where responsibility has been abdicated, opportunity lurks. You want to be the one seizing that opportunity, because you can be damn well sure the wrong kinds of people will be seizing that opportunity. And look, I guess I'd leave that thought with people, you know, get active, whether that be protesting like what we sort of did to Scott Morrison this week, where we prodded him and said, speak up. There are people that have concerns here, and he spoke up, which was excellent. Whether it be writing to your local MPs saying, hey, I go to this church, everyone will be hearing about this if you vote this way. It's about being active, writing petitions and doing all of that. It sounds boring. I would rather be doing other things on Saturday. I'd rather be chasing girls, and I'd rather be playing video games. But the reality is, if you don't, where responsibilities have been abdicated, opportunity lurks. Be there.
Well, nice little truism. Professor Flint, Take Back Your Country. Great show coming up. Amongst other things you're advocating for is the advent of recall elections. Just summarise those again for us as we wrap up the show.
Yes, well, you may all recall that a few years ago we were told by the politicians and by the newspaper editors that if we voted in favour of extending 3-year terms to 4-year terms, this would significantly include the quality of government. I think the The first government elected in New South Wales was one of our worst governments. It doesn't improve the quality. What will improve the quality is doing what we did, what the people of Australia did to form this country. And you won't recall this because you're all too young. I don't recall it. I've read about it. But what happened in the 19th century was when they attempted to federate, when people realized it was time to form one country, when the politicians appointed a convention and the convention reported back to the colonial parliaments, they could never agree with one another. We would never have federated had we left it to the politicians. We'd be 5 or 6 countries now. We wouldn't be a single country. And the way it was solved was by handing the question over to the people, by having the people elect a convention, providing that the convention's conclusions after consultation would be put straight to the people. It wouldn't go through the parliaments. And we really need this strong ingredient of direct democracy. We need a second Corowa plan. We federated through the Corowa plan, which school children would not have learnt of because they've got so much other junk cluttered into their curriculum.
I'm going to look that up. Wow.
If we had another Corowa plan, I think the Australian people would find a solution to significantly improve the governance of Australia.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation this evening. Thank you for your comments. Trust you've enjoyed the show. And let me encourage you again to visit goodsource.news. That's good, SAUCE.news, and become a subscriber to our intermittent newsletter there, where we will send you some of our hottest articles and show episodes to your email box. You never know when conservative media is going to be kicked off corporate media like Facebook and Twitter. So make sure we've got your contact details and keep you informed there. And of course, we would love to count you as one of our supporters with extended interviews and behind the scenes access to the various shows. A new show is produced every day, including Take Back Your Country by Professor Flint, and this show every Tuesday. And Professor Flint's show is on Thursdays. Thank you again to the panelists for joining me today. And that's it for this episode of Pellowe Talk, and we will see you next week.